try to help you in that process. Not to worry too much. We're going to talk about integrating search appliance to the Drupal site. Actually, with several Drupal sites, it's a Drupal project I'm still working on. I'm Willems. I work at Amplexor in Belgium. I have 4 years of experience as a Drupal consultant, and the last 2 years I'm also the team coach of the Belgian Amplexor. I'm currently working at the VDAE. It's an important institution for families in Belgium for employment, public employment. It's a project Amplexor is running together with another company. So after this intro, I'm going to give an intro. I'm going to present, talk about the appliance itself, Google Search Appliance. Then I'm going to focus on the Drupal integration, so all the stuff you have to do for Drupal to get the appliance started. And following up with a small conclusion about the project, and maybe there will be some time for questions. So in the intro, I will talk a little about the project, which involves an intranet and a public website. I'm going to explain a little about the infrastructure of the project, the architecture we used, and a little disclaimer. I'm going to say a little thing about all I'm not going to say about the appliance. Our customer is very group-minded. They have integration with Gmail. They use Hangouts, they use Google Drive, Google Calendar, Google Sites, Google Docs, all the stuff. And we have to integrate the search experience in the new intranet and the public website and manage in one search tool, search functionality. They needed faceted search based on metadata, and I'm going to explain later on how we handle the metadata and how we implement it in Drupal. How we present metadata to the appliance. They're also planning on using the same appliance for other applications. That should be possible to use one and the same appliance for several applications. This overview is probably not very visible, but just a small overview of the architecture we're using there. They have a very complex architecture, and this is only the Drupal part, so the part for the Drupal site. There is an internal front end with Apaches there for doing several tasks like load balancing. They are sending the requests for the Drupal site to a load balancer, which is dividing the requests over 2 Varnish servers. I don't know if you ever heard of Varnish, that's a reverse proxy caching server. Those are again sending the requests to the load balancer, who divides the requests that go through Varnish to the two Drupal web servers. We have one MySQL master database, and we have another slave. The slave is just for disaster recovery. It's not really for high performance. The most of the work, actual work for anonymous users, will be done by the Varnish, who will reply to anonymous requests. There is a NAS setup for the files, because the 2 web servers are using the same files, of course. And here you see the setup of the appliances. It's also a load balance setup. So a search request that a user sending to the application, to Drupal, is then subsequently sent by the Drupal web server to the load balancer, who divides and decides to which Google Search Appliance it is sent. So this means our customer has to have at least 2 appliances. Those 2 appliances are for production environment, and of course you need another one for all your development or testing environments. So you have to, as customer, you have to take this into account cost-wise too, because one appliance is already not cheap. And this is a very minimal setup because they're having their sites hosted by an external company, and those they test deployed of new releases that involve the Google Search Appliance too. So if they test it, they have to test it on those appliances too. But that could have impact, performance impact on your searches in production. A lot of things about Google Search that I'm not going to be covering, for the simple reason that we're not using all the features. There's a lot of features, and a lot of them that we're not needing right now. We could be needing them in the future applications. For what concerns the frontends, it's obvious we're using a Drupal frontend, so we're not using the out-of-the-box frontend of the Google appliance, because the appliance comes with an out-of-the-box frontend that you can configure. Social Connect, it's to extend people search, but as users are very are actually the entities too in Drupal, not that unlike nodes. We have no need for a separate kind of search for users. Cloud Connect is an integration with publicly available content. We did not have for that yet. Then forms authentication. There were some problems with how Drupal is creating forms and how the forms are being kept unique and secure. So we could not use the Google Forms authentication for the crawler to log into Drupal. I'll explain it later how we solved those problems. Mirroring of the Google Search Appliance. It's not unlike MySQL replication. We don't really need that now. We already have a load balance setup. A little word about the appliance itself. I'm going to say something about the product, how to configure it, about the version manager, and last but not least about the Google support. I don't know if you know it, but the Google Search Appliance actually is a physical device. It really is something you can touch. It's a box, a yellow box. It's meant for crawling and indexing. Of course, it's a real search solution, and it has a Google-like front end out of the box. There's a minimum license cut. It includes 500,000 documents. You have to be aware of what you're having the appliance index. At the VDAB we have 4 environments for development only. If you multiply this by each application you want to crawl, and you easily get the limit of maximum 100,000 documents per collection. So if you include all crawlable attachments, crawlable versions of pages, or duplicate content, 500,000 documents isn't really that much if you take that into account. I'm talking about 2 sites now, an intranet and a public site, but if you add more and more applications and you multiply it by all the environments you're using the appliance on, you can easily transgress your minimum. Pricing starts at $1,000 a month for the minimum setup. What's typically Google Search about the appliance? Use of keywords to manipulate results. How Google handles synonyms out of the box or configured. How you can make your results of searches context dependent. For instance, the user who is making the search can be the context. And caching results. So about the configuration of the appliance itself. This is a view on the administration console. The most important things we are using is setting up of the crawling and indexing of your applications. You also have to configure how you want the appliance to serve your content. When it is searched, there's a very interesting set of search and reports interface in the appliance, and of course there's some administrative tasks you have to be able to do on the appliance itself. Crawl and index, there's a lot of things to configure when you use the appliance. First, the most important thing is your collections. You have to interpret a collection as an index of your documents. So an index is actually where you should see that if you have separate applications, they would all have separate collections. In our case, we have a collection per site, per environment. As I said, for the development environment and testing, we have only one appliance, not load balanced. There are a great many collections there, because also if you develop locally, you can have your site crawled by the appliance. So if you have, for instance, 4 developers working on 2 sites, that means 8 collections already. So we have many collections. I'm going to talk a little about how to instruct the appliance to crawl the URLs, how to use feeds, what crawl schedule is, how to implement some extra HTTP headers, which we need with Drupal. A very important thing, document dates, how to tell the appliance what the relevant date is of a document, and a little word about the freshness tuning. This is a little overview of collections on our development environment, development appliance. So content indexes for several domains are kept in separate collections. And how do you identify a collection? Very simple, by URL patterns. So you can use regular expression like patterns to identify a collection. And the appliance really identifies a document by its URL pattern. It's very important to understand. Crawl URLs. You instruct the appliance where to crawl. You instruct it what to crawl by the patterns. And you also instruct the appliance what to keep out of the index, which is very important. There's a lot of patterns that are excluded from the index by default. It's also very important to realize where to configure your exclusions. We made an error while developing. Suddenly we realized you could exclude patterns in your collections. So you can exclude patterns for your whole appliance, but you can also choose to do this in the collections. But the thing we didn't realize was that when you exclude them in your collections, the appliance is not taking the documents out of the index, it's just not serving them. And after a few days, our license maximum was reached. So this is a bit of a minor point. In my point of view, you have to make all your exclusion patterns on the appliance itself. That means they're valid for all your collections. This could be probably a problem if you want some patterns excluded for one application and not for another. You have to take this into account. Feeds are another way to tell your appliance what documents have to be crawled. So you can configure crawl URLs. You can say to the appliance, these are the URL patterns you have to crawl. You can also create feeds. And you can disclose the content by creating a feed. You can just publish your feed on your site, or you can push it to the appliance with an API. I'll talk about the API later on, so because we're using it for administrative tasks. This is simple. You can set up a crawl schedule. You just set it to crawl continuously. This has an impact, of course, because if some applications and some search are more critical than others, you can change this. So you can make sure that some collections or some of your sites are crawled more frequently than others. Now we just have a continuous crawl of all our collections. The more collections you have, the slower they will be crawled, of course, because it has limited resources, the appliance. You can add headers to the requests the crawler is sending to your server. We had to use this because we needed to identify the request coming from the crawler. Now, one very important thing, I didn't emphasize this about the architecture, but it's very important to realize that the Google Search Appliance is behind a firewall. So all requests from the web server to the appliance are considered to be secure. They're already behind the firewall. If someone is hacking into the VKB infrastructure, is going behind the firewall, all kinds of issues are for sure. So we can assume that if we add a header, and we can identify it in the Drupal, we can assume that it's the crawler that's making the request. So we're making an assumption because the crawler is behind the firewall. Of course, you all know, developers know, you can forge HTTP headers, so this could be a problem because, in my opinion, another minus point, this is like hard-coded. There's no way of making a dynamic header. You cannot encrypt this, for instance. This is just entered in the interface of the appliance. There's no way you can SSH into the appliance and do all kinds of stuff, command line. No, this all is through the interface. You can just enter a value here. So no dynamic headers to be entered. We know that the header is being entered, and we assume if we see the header coming in the server, that it's the crawler making the request. This is very important, dates. We have to instruct the appliance which field on your document is the date field you want to use for sorting by date. And you also have to instruct the appliance what the format is. For instance, we added a meta tag, date changed, typical changed for Drupal, and then a certain date format, and there we tell the appliance what meta tag it has to look for, to recognize as a date, and what the format will be. Freshness tuning. You can tell the appliance what to crawl frequently and what to recrawl regardless HTTP status code. You can also tell what to recrawl as fast as possible. Serving. So the appliance has a lot of data in its indexes, but there's also the serving of the responses to search requests. We're not using a lot of front-end configuration because we're using Drupal as a front-end to show you the result of searches, but we do have to identify and connect every collection with a front-end. Then, this is important too, result biasing. You know, there's a way of biasing what Google is returning as a result for certain searches. You have to create some kind of a policy. Then you choose your biasing. For instance, in our case, we don't use source biasing. Source biasing is biasing by the patterns. So you can say certain patterns, these are more important than other documents, having other patterns. You can also do some date biasing, saying give documents with recent dates always more importance. We just use metadata biasing, and we add taxonomy tags in metadata fields of the documents. And then we tell the appliance to be aware that if search terms are coming in which are corresponding to that taxonomy, it will have to be biased and has a higher priority. So it comes higher in the return list. Dynamic navigation. We can use these options in our queries after a user has clicked on certain facets. By adding these attributes, the appliance will keep track of counts for documents having particular values or particular meta tags. So you instruct or you tell the crawler about you give it some properties of your document, and then in the appliance you have to explain what kind of meta tag fields these are. This is very interesting for developers, status and reports, especially when you're busy implementing the appliance. You get the crawl status, a lot of crawl diagnostics, very interesting real-time diagnostics, information about the crawl queue, and of course there are also logs you can look into. You get an overview of the general crawl status where you can see how many documents are fixed. crawl diagnostics. This is very interesting. This can sometimes explain why documents corresponding to certain terms, certain patterns, are not appearing in your search results. Sometimes you can see here that the appliance has already crawled a document but is not serving it yet. It takes some time before there's a lag between indexing and serving. Real-time diagnostics. This is very interesting. For instance, if you're setting up your integration and you don't get the crawler to index your site, you can put in the request here manually and see what the response is that the crawler is getting. You mostly see there the header or the HTTP status, what the problem is. This is the crawl queue I was talking about. You see several collections here corresponding to patterns and how many URLs still have to be crawled. You have search logs, not unlike web server access logs. There are also event logs, more for system events on the appliance. Another important part of the appliance is the administration interface. You can create user accounts and manage them, have some SSL settings, do some import or export of your configuration, and last but not least, remote support. User account. We created an extra administrator user to authenticate for API requests. I will say a little more about this later. If you need to secure the crawling requests, you'll need to install a certificate. We also did this, and it was a bit of a pain because the appliance is using a specific way of having the private key and the certificate imported. As I said, you can import or export your complete configuration. Looks handy, but to be honest, I didn't want to use it for our deploy to production because we have quite a lot of environment-dependent settings. So instead of doing this, I did actually the old-fashioned way. I made a document explaining all the values that needed to be entered in the configuration, because I know there were a lot of environment-dependent settings. Very important, remote support. You can allow Google to access your appliance. Of course, then you have to open some ports and have the firewall allow entrance through those ports. There's also a Google version manager. The appliance has a life cycle itself. Not so long ago, there was the version 7 that we deployed with some new features. You manage these versions by the version manager. I already mentioned support. There are several ways of support. There's a very interesting Google Enterprise Support portal that you can get access to when you have an enterprise contract with Google. There's the possibility of remote support, and there's quite good documentation to be found about the appliance. And I have to say this, you're paying top dollar for this, but the support is very good. We have all our cases, and there are quite some of them. All of them were solved. And there's support in several time zones too, so mostly the reply is very fast. It's also very easy to increase how critical your case is, so they notice how important you think of certain cases. A little more about the actual integration with Drupal. Crawl access control. So you need Drupal to control how crawl you let it access your content. How will you provide data to the crawler? How do you form search queries? How to create facets, which is in part the same as the previous. How to display your results, and a little word about the API. As I said, there's an identifier in the request header. I talked about it earlier. And of course you have to create a crawler user in Drupal with certain permissions. We had a custom, I don't know if you noticed, but you can use a custom session inc file to have Drupal handle sessions differently for certain users. For instance, we don't need a session for the crawler. That's not interesting. Another reason is we don't, the crawler doesn't really need to log in manually. We automate the login of the crawler for every crawler request by using this custom session. And I'm repeating what I said before about security. We are assuming all traffic is behind the firewall. It's obvious what's the danger here. Someone can forge a request, the header, and pretend to be the crawler. That's why having a real crawler user with a certain role is also important. So you limit the access anyway by doing this. The crawler will see published content. It's very hard to see. Well, it's actually, you can see. Just a very little code to check what header is in the request to know if this is the crawler, and then in the session, in the settings PHP, we use the other sessions file. And there we have 2 users for the 2 load balanced appliances. You know, there are 2 appliances, so 2 crawler users. Providing data, you have to publish content, and you have to enrich the content with custom metadata. This is a very simple view. It's a bit strange, but the appliance cannot handle a sitemap.xml as a starting point. So we just created a view sitemap, and we tell the appliance to start there. This is a starting point to content. You provide data to the crawler by adding meta tags with, for instance, vocabulary terms. Adding metadata, you do this in your custom modules by a utility method, and then eventually you use the Drupal add HTML head to add the meta tags. We have a custom search module and other custom modules. We implement hook preprocess page to add general metadata like what kind of node type, because we're using this in the facets, and specific metadata we can use, for instance, to personalize searches. Forming search queries. We're using, of course, a content module for this, and also for the results page. We're using custom modules to alter the queries we are actually sending to the appliance, and to alter the results we get from the appliance. These are the content modules we're using. The Google Appliance module. 2 important tasks it does for us, not much more than that. Just translate search into a request to the appliance, then parse the results, the XML results from the appliance. Then there's also the Google Appliance Suggest, which offers an autocomplete search form, and where you can have some suggestion caching. This is just a view on the interface of the appliance. We extended this settings form for the appliance to add a lot of custom settings, because we're using the Google administrative API to send some special tasks to the appliance, of which I will say a little more later on. Most important hooks offered by the Google Appliance module are, of course, the query alter. We have to alter those queries for specific requirements, and we are altering the results that the module already created. We still alter them to our specific needs to create our facets, for instance. This is an example of a result of a search. On the left side, the rows, several rows. On the right side, you see we have a lot of facets, filters actually, and those links are created by our custom modules we altered the information we received from the appliance and then created those links. I'll say a little more about that later. So you retrieve facets from search results using that hook. Now, how do we do this? We define a facets array. We create our own hook facets info, and we retrieve all defined facets by this. Custom modules can implement this hook. For instance, one module uses a taxonomy, and it can decide to implement hook facets info to tell our intranet search model that this module is offering information that can be used in a facet, a filter. Then you can filter on that taxonomy in your on your search page. Very simple to implement it. In this case, the module intranet info page is implementing the hook, and it's telling information that there should be able to filter on information type. Then you see here in the facets there are several types of pages, information types on which you can filter. So when you're doing a search, you're getting a lot of responses. The appliance has seen in the metadata fields what keywords should be taken into account, what kind of counters should be kept for those kind of metadata fields. You get it in the response, and we use the response and the counters in them to create our filters here. So we inspect the results, the XML payload from the appliance, to fill those facets. And we use the count that the appliance is responding to us. And we give them back in the filters. So you see in the result you're getting how many of those documents have, for instance, the tag nota for. Then you can click on that, and a new search query is sent to the appliance with an added filter for that term. So we render the facets based on an altered result. Building the facets output means, as I said, looping the facet store, creating those links, and maintaining the filters. You can also remove filters. Important are, you can sort on date range also. There, we can filter on dates, that's why dates are very important. Those are documents less than a month old or less than 3 months old. And what appliance sees as required fields. So if you click one of those filters, the documents are required to have that field, that value for that field. So most of the code actually in the module goes in building those facets. You probably know about the facet API, but actually for us in implementing the Google Search Appliance, it was easier to create our facets with their own custom facet API. So you can add filters, remove filters. Also important and correct operands. You can send search queries to the appliance with several operators like ends or operators. Important is also that we translate the URL you're creating by clicking on a certain filter into the actual query that has to be sent to the appliance, because it's not exactly the same. As I said, you can also disable filters you already clicked on with the removal icon. And from certain pages it's possible, for instance, if you have a more events link, to have predefined filters. When you arrive at the search result page with a predefined filter, you can remove that too. So this is the URL that we are constructing. For instance, here we're looking for a vocabulary term, province, and then we'll get a response with all documents or a number of documents having that meta tag. In this case, we want all documents which have as value for that meta tag field webkleren or inschatting. In this case, webkleren and inschatting. As I said, there's not a one-to-one correspondence of how we create the URLs for the search and what is sent to the appliance, so we have to translate this too. There's also a little integration into views. We provide a hidden field as a token in this view. It can be used in a link in the footer text. This field user themes can contain multiple values, and we provide the appliance operand format or and, so the values are properly concatenated. Now just a little word about displaying results. Several things you have to do. The Google Appliance module comes with templates. We need to override them. We also use display suite, and of course the hook results alter. We have a custom view mode, and we use, I don't know if you know display suite, I'm not going to explain what display suite is, but we use display suite to have preprocessed or code fields, or just using the API of display suite to create code fields, fields we want to show in the results. This is a view of a build mode, and here we created some custom fields like the appliance absolute URL and the snippet the appliance is returning. We're making a code field of this, and then we can easily add it in the build mode. So, for instance, here there's a field title and a field of the snippet we're getting from the appliance, and some metadata. There's ordering and paging. We can order on relevance or date, and there's an indication of what current page is. The appliance keeps track of how many responses you can get for a certain search, and a Google like pager. I would give a little demo, but I don't think I have enough time. I would like to say a little word about the use of the API. So it's possible to instruct the appliance to do several things. You see this lock next to it because you need to authenticate, of course, to be able to do some administrative tasks on the API. Another way to instruct the appliance to do certain things is to use feeds. Now, we API for several things. We can instruct the API to start the recrawl of specific pages after certain events, and we can instruct the API to exclude unlinked attachments from the index. Because if once the appliance knows that an attachment is on the web server, it will keep serving it. For instance, if someone removes in Drupal an attachment from a node, it doesn't mean that it's removed from the server, so the appliance is still finding the attachment and is still showing it in the results. So we needed some API requests to have it removed once a week. When does it happen? For instance, I talked about our extended settings form. When that is submitted, we already sent some requests to the appliance instructing it to do some things. Also when the rules, I hope you heard about rules, when some rules are fired, and in some cases when cron runs. So once a week we remove all indexes, remove all attachments from the index which are not being linked anymore in nodes. A little overview of rules we're using. We're telling the appliance to recrawl documents on load updates, inserts or deletes. because otherwise they could be still served too long after they are changed or removed. Stages of the call. You have to create an XML with a certain instruction in it. For instance, this is telling the appliance to recrawl now certain patterns. As I said, you cannot allow any request to an appliance to do administrative tasks, so you have to authenticate, you have to tell the appliance, I am someone you know about, I can do this, I can instruct to, for instance, a recrawl. You create a put request with the recrawl command in this case, for a particular pattern you want recrawled. If it fails, because your token is in cache, in our case cache is kept in memory with memcache, that if it fails, it probably your token is outdated. So we do a new post request to receive the authentication token again. You extract the token and you retry your put. So quite some technical information here. Our conclusion about integrating the appliance in Drupal. Disadvantages. Is it expensive? Well, yes, it's expensive, and no. Depends on the requirements. It's not that expensive, depending on what kind of search you compare it to. For instance, if you have your customer has an API, network subscription, but is actually only using the search, then maybe the search appliance is not that expensive. Of course, it's another case if your customer has an API subscription and is really heavily using all the possibilities, all the services of API, then, for instance, API could be more interesting. Another thing, documentation, really good, but incomplete. A lot of our cases were just actually asking some questions to Google. Questions of which we didn't find responses in the fora or in documentation. It's a yellow box, but actually a black box. There's a lot of things going on internally you don't know about. No one knows how the Google algorithms are really working. Yes, you can study, but you can never know. As I said, you only have contact to the appliance through an interface. You never get into the server itself. There's a lot of features, but a lot of them are irrelevant if you want Drupal as a frontend. There's a lot of stuff you have to do yourself that you're not using, that we were not using of the appliance. There's a bit of a lock-in, of course. Once you make such an effort, such a big chunk of your budget, then you will stick to it. And there's a bit of a learning curve too. But that's actually the case for most search solutions. The API is limited for targeted requests. So now the administrative API requests we're sending to the appliance are very, massive, blunt. It's doing a recrawl for a whole pattern. It's very difficult to do targeted requests. And this is quite a disadvantage for us too. Not all functionalities and all languages yet are supported. For instance, which is quite important in Belgium, which has Dutch as well as French. French with a lot of accent. There is no insensitive search for the Dutch version. But Google is working on that. Of course, quite some advantages. High performance, very fast machine. It's very feature rich. I think you can you see that from all the possible configurations in the console. It's really top-notch search functionality with all the experience Google has with this. And it has excellent support. So our final conclusion is in our case, our customer already has a lot of contact with Google and an appliance. So if your customer already has it, yeah, sure, use it. And of course, if it fits your requirements. Another condition, your developers have to be familiar with it or have some time getting familiar with it. And if cost is not a showstopper, then sure, use it. But if not all of those conditions apply or some don't apply, you should consider Apache Solr, for which there is a lot of support in the Drupal community. Any questions?
Hello. I want to know how to change the search snippet you show to the user.
Yes, that's difficult. So the snippet is something that you're just getting from the appliance. We took it and we used displayed it to have it as a content of a field we're going to show in the result, because our customer was satisfied with how the snippet looks. If your customer is not satisfied with what the snippet is giving you back, you're in a problem. You have a problem.
Okay, I understand. Another question. You said you built a custom sitemap for appliance, and did you include some specific meta text for those pages built for appliance sitemap? For example, if you need some date filters, you include them in that page. I mean,
the date filters are a meta tag field on the documents themselves.
Yes, but those are custom pages, not something standard in Drupal, because usually we have only basic things in meta text and don't have additional fields. You built a new node, kind of a display node for content.
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question correctly. Are you saying how a document?
My general question would be how you add a custom filter in appliance.
A custom filter, like, for instance?
Something you don't have in appliance, for example. I don't have an example. I worked with appliance 1 year ago, and from what I remember, I had such a problem.
Well, as I said before, you can add a lot of custom filters. You just have to add a meta tag in your document, a certain field with a certain value. Then you can instruct the appliance, this meta tag exists. Take it into consideration when you index the document, and if you do that, you can create filters on it, because in the response you're getting from your searches, there will be information concerning those keywords, like for instance counters.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
Thanks. You mentioned that the learning curve is a bit steep. I mean, something like if you only have time with your developers, can you give us a rough example, as in something like how hard it is for, in case of a team that's totally new to Google Search Appliance, how long it takes to get familiar with it in case of a normally working team with experienced developers but totally new to the Search Appliance?
Well, it's impossible for me to estimate that. So it's completely dependent on the qualities of your team, for instance, but it's also dependent on the requirements of your project.
If it was not a secret, in case of your project you are talking about, in this case, how long did it take just get the grip of Search Appliance? I assume that you switched from Solr experience from the past, like something like that, right?
Yeah, we didn't have any experience with the appliance whatsoever, and I have to say the requirements were not clear for the customer in the beginning also, so it's been a long process. So it's a bit difficult to say if you compact it in time and say, now, if we only did search functionality in time, maybe for one person it would have been 3 weeks. But it's very difficult to put an estimation on it because it's spread over a very long time.
Yeah, obviously. I just wanted to have a vague idea.
Yeah, but the best advice in this case is to, before you even start implementing something, first, of course, you try to understand the exact requirement of your customer, and then you try to study as much documentation as possible of the appliance. Then you can explain your customer better what is possible with the appliance and what is not. We had actually a lot of trial and error in this case.
Yeah, but this is kind of a trap 24 because you said that the documentation is a bit lacking, and if you don't have experience, how could you fathom that what are the depths of the project when even the client is not sure about the exact details of the project? It goes in a vicious circle like that.
So maybe a better answer was, I don't know.
I mean, there are some trainings or something like that, because a lot of...
not that I know of.
A lot of Google services have trainings.
I think I think it also depends on exactly the kind of contract your customer has with Google, because I don't know much about the contract our customer has, but I know those contracts are pretty custom. So your support is you're getting, and also your documentation support and your informational support will depend on the kind of contact and contract you can have with Google.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think that was a bit hard to answer the question, actually.
Hi, I'm just wondering, what kind of multi-language solution did you use? Did by any chance you use entity translation?
Yes, well, for a very limited pages, because as it happens, this intranet is one language, there are very limited pages in other languages.
I'm just curious how you would work with entity translation, because then you have an entity which has some fields which are the same for all languages, and some are not. And the meta tag approach seems like it's a limit here.
Yeah, you would have very complex meta tags indeed. I guess you will have to create some kind of format, some kind of your own meta tag fields, and keeping some some formats.
From your answer, I deduce that Google doesn't have a solution for this.
Well, Google has a lot of is taking a lot of consideration for languages, but it's always on document level.
Okay, so
properties
they don't
are
have this
property.
notion of a document which contains more languages.
Not that I know of now.
Or at least a way to connect some documents. Let's say this document is the version of this document in another language, with some fields different and some not.
Well, the only thing I know is that Google identifies a document by its pattern. So if you want some documents to be considered differently, for instance for a language, they need another pattern.
Okay.
You can also, of course, you also have language information in the meta tags. Telling that's out of the box. Google tries to find out what language your document is in, but as you say, field translation could be an issue.
Yeah.
I didn't have to solve it.
Okay. I was just wondering if it's possible. That's all. Thanks.
No more questions? Okay. Thank you for the attention.